So today I'm talking with Marja Lubeck, former Labour MP. We are in Warkworth at the Oaks. It is March 2024, about 5 months since the last election. How are you?
I'm good, thank you. Yourself?
Yeah, I'm very good. What have you been doing for the last few months since the election?
Well, it's actually been a bit of a restful time for me. After the election, I went to the Netherlands and spent some time with my family there, with my parents and my sister and her husband and my nephews. And yeah, it was really enjoyable.
Now, I already know quite a bit about you, but for the people that may not know so much about you, can you give me some information about your background, your life, where you grew up, and how you came to New Zealand?
Sure. Well, we have to go quite a bit back. In 1989, I went to New Zealand for a couple of years. That was the plan, together with my then boyfriend. When we arrived here, after about a year, he sort of felt it wasn't really his country, wasn't stressful enough, I suppose. Went back to the Netherlands. I stayed, and after a while, I ran into my now husband. So that is 34 years ago, and I've been here ever since.
You ran for Parliament, but what were some of the moments before that in your life that really influenced that decision to run for Parliament?
Yeah, well, it's a funny story because it wasn't really a conscious decision. I was working for Air New Zealand as an international flight attendant, and after a while became a delegate in the Flight Attendant Union, was elected as president, and after a few years entered into a merger agreement with one of the largest unions in New Zealand, the EPMU, to become ADTU. And as that union, we were affiliated to the Labour Party, and someone asked me to run for Parliament, or rather to run into a campaign to get the party vote out for the Labour Party. I thought it was an interesting concept. I didn't know much about politics, so I put my name down to run a campaign, not ever expecting that I would end up in Parliament. But it was 6 weeks before the election. Jacinda Ardern took over as leader of the Labour Party. And all of a sudden, our numbers changed significantly, and completely unexpected, I ended up in Parliament.
So going back to your union days, then what were some of the key things that kind of drove you into that, or brought you that calling to work in the union movement?
Yeah, I guess there was an issue early on in my tenure with Air New Zealand during my training days, in fact, where I wasn't treated the way I should have. So there was some unjustifiable issue there. That made me really think about the role that delegates play in those unions, because they speak up for the people that have no voice, and so that's why I sort of entered into that journey. And then I discovered that I got immense satisfaction out of serving, helping my members. That was one of the reasons I did a law degree as well. Not to be a lawyer, but just to better serve my members. And I guess that whole concept of serving and wanting to be of service sort of carried on into my MP role.
And so how long were you in the unions?
So I became a delegate early on after entering in Air New Zealand. I was elected as president in 2007. Mm-hmm. And then so I did 4 terms.
Wow, four terms. And did you feel that the time in the unions was a period of time that really helped you reshape any views, or did you have most of those views when you were going into the union already?
Not really. I had always been employed in places where there were no unions, so I didn't really understand the significant role that unions actually play for a large amount of our workforce. And so being at the grassroots level and dealing with issues that members encountered and the business, I really discovered that there's a really important role to play as a sort of intermediate person between the members and the company.
So once you decided to run for Parliament, then obviously coming from, can I use the union ticket? I'm not sure what we call those things. Yeah. So what was your main ambition then? Was it mostly around employment relations and improving the lives of workers and things, or was it more general?
It became that, and yes, the union ticket meant that I had the backing of the union. So that means that when you get a list placing, it might be slightly higher because of the input and the skills that you have behind you that tick certain boxes. And I guess once I discovered that I ended up in Parliament, that became my main issue to run on, because of course that is what I knew and it had my passion. It was one of the reasons I started the law degree. So in my maiden speech I made a real reference about working people standing with me in the House, because that is what I felt I was there for. And of course when you're there, you find out that basically the opportunities are limitless in that role. You can pick up any work, really. And so I extended on that vision, but it started with working people, definitely, yes.
So of course the election happened and you found out that you were going to be an MP. I guess you find out that information over the first, maybe the night or a few days. What were your initial thoughts from like going from campaign mode to, oh, I'm now an MP kind of mode?
Oh, shell shock.
Yeah.
It was 23 September 2017. It's actually my son's birthday. And we were watching a big screen in Orewa during the election night. And at some stage, I looked at my husband and I said, I think I'm going to end up in Parliament. And he said, what do you mean? I said, oh, look at the numbers. I was just totally not expecting it. And so that was on a Saturday. On a Monday, I was in Parliament, and I actually received a text message from my boss at Air New Zealand to say, well, if you're going to have a new job, you're going to have to resign with us. And so you can sort of see the sort of unexpected turn of events it was for me to find myself in Wellington, in Parliament.
And at that time, if my memory serves me right, there wasn't a guarantee of the government being a Labour government or a Labour-led government. Yeah. It could have been Mr. Peters was going between the two sides at the time. When that was happening, but you were a brand new MP, how did that kind of, what was kind of happening around Parliament at that time while the important people were making all of those kind of agreements and discussions? What were you doing at that time?
Well, I guess it's a good question. Thinking back about that time, I was one of the people that came in there unexpectedly, but I wasn't the only one. There were quite a few behind me as well on the list that also came in not expecting to be there. And so some of those people had more experience with Parliament and politics than I did. So they knew what it meant, the difference between opposition and government, the roles that you would be playing in that regard. Everything was very new to me. I had only been to the Parliament building once before in my life. So even just to find my way around the massive building, but also the induction days that they put you on so that you get to learn about the different departments, what they do, what select committees are, everything really. So those first weeks for me, and actually I think there were only a couple of weeks between the election and the announcement of the government. Mm-hmm. Those were filled just with learning and coming to terms with being in the place and understanding what that would mean.
Do you, when you become an MP, do they give you like a person to within your party to mentor you? Do they give you like a staff? How do you go from being mayor, living at home, and getting on a plane and arriving in Parliament, and then all of a sudden becoming an MP? What are the kind of like steps?
It's so different. You can't compare it. There's no other job I could even ever compare it to. For starters, there's no job description. You don't sign a contract. There's no terms and conditions. For me, that was just so bizarre because it's not anything I'd ever known. You end up in that place. Luckily, the processes have become better over the years, and we were assigned buddy MPs. Mine was Potter Williams, beautiful, lovely person, and she was really good in helping me sort of understand what was happening, and that together with the induction courses helped you get your feet on the ground and understand what that journey was that you were about to start up on.
So you walk into Parliament for the first time. Had you met Jacinda, and had you met any of the other senior members of the caucus at that time, or did you have to say, "Hey, I'm Marja Lubeck, and I'm one of your MPs"? I mean, what was the kind of process there?
Yeah, so I had met several of them, including Andrew Little, Jacinda Ardern, because during the campaign they were all very making themselves available to come up to the different electorates and help us bring our messages out there. But I didn't know them, of course. I only met them during the campaign, and everything is always hectic and rushed. So,
Sure.
yes, you may recognize the face, but you haven't built up any kind of relationship or rapport with the people. So that was kind of new, a whole new team of people that you didn't really know anybody from. And I guess overlay that feeling of entering into a whole new team into the fact that I came from an environment where I was basically having to do everything myself. You're on top of your own agenda, your meetings, your flight bookings, or whatever you need to do, like a normal person. But all of a sudden, you realize you have to recruit staff for starters, and those people are going to take over your inbox, your diary, your schedule, how you live your life, and all that new and uncertainty is really, really overwhelming when you first enter that place. And I do remember that feeling of being overwhelmed.
Wow. And travel, obviously much more travel than, although you were an international flight attendant, but that daily traveling to Parliament and back, how did you kind of adjust to being away from home so much?
It did end up being one of the hardest things, I think, of the job, is the amount of travel involved and the amount of hours you do, the time away from home base. So what I would do on a Monday, during the day, I would start traveling down, because I live on top of the electorate. I would start traveling down towards the airport, and that meant that I could have some meetings and some visits in between while I made my way to the airport. Arrived in Wellington on a Monday night, got up early on Tuesday morning. Usually we start off with our caucus meeting, the Labour caucus meeting. And then you have your 3 sitting days. And on Thursday night, after you finish, I would catch the plane back, land at Auckland Airport, and then make my way back home. That would mean that generally somewhere around 10 or 11 o'clock that night, I would be back at home. And then on Friday, Saturday, Sunday, you would be back in the electorate, doing your visits, going to the events. And then on the Monday, you did it all over again. So it became a very full-on week after week.
Yeah. You were a list MP. For people who don't necessarily know the difference between a list MP and an electorate MP, and some people even possibly value one more than the other, what would be your best way to describe the difference between those two roles and whether or not they are more similar than they are different?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of misunderstanding on the names for the different MPs. So basically you can say that in Parliament there's no difference whatsoever between a list MP or an electorate MP. We all have our offices there, we have our staff, we have our select committees. We're part of different caucuses, we have staff, we have house duties. So in Parliament, it's exactly the same, there's no difference. But then when you come to the electorate MP gets more funding to set up an office, to have staff, to do their duties within the electorate, looking after their constituents. The list MP gets an allocation to do their work, but not as much, because you're also expected to do more nationwide, like the representations I did in different communities. But that doesn't mean that you can't represent your constituents, because for some reasons people might want to see you rather than the electorate MP. But also if you are part of the communities, like I was part of especially the northern side of the electorate. And I always heard from people that they didn't feel represented, they didn't have a voice in Parliament. So I decided early on that I would use my funding and just find ways to set up an office and be available for constituent work, and basically just treat it as being an electorate MP. So I guess because there's no job description, you can make the job whatever you like, and you can represent people as far and wide as you choose. It has the danger that you stretch yourself too far because there not being any boundaries, and that is a danger of the job, that kind of burnout. Yeah.
And of course, the Dutch community, you were very heavily involved in the Dutch community as well, which we really appreciate. On TV, a lot of people will get the impression that all MPs do across the aisle is argue with each other and make often quite bad jokes about each other and in their speeches. And of course, we probably deep down understand that it's for sound bites to go and put them out on TV or anything like that, because you don't have as much time as we have, for example, to have a conversation. Is that the reality of Parliament, or is that just the ugly face of it that the public gets to see?
Yeah, it's probably fair to say it's the thing people know most of Parliament, because question time and the speeches in the House, when it gets broadcast, that's what people get to see on TV. So question time was never something I thought that could ever appeal to me, because it just looks a little bit adversarial and like acting sometimes. But when you're there in the middle of it, you find yourself participating quite passionately. If it's not for the reason that otherwise you could easily switch off from it, right? So you have to be in the middle of it. I was actually known as one of the loudest hecklers in the place, and I never thought that would be a reputation that I would become. But it is, like you said, an impression, and in fact, you get very close and friendly with several MPs that could be from other parties, because at the end of the day, you're doing the same job. Maybe you have different ways of getting to certain outcomes, but you are still there to serve, and that kind of is a common denominator. So when you look at, for example, select committees where most relationships happen behind the scenes and are not so public, we have very constructive working relationships, and it also depends on what chair you have in those committees, but they work very differently from what you see on TV.
Mm. And which select committees were your favourite select committees that you're working on?
Well, I was part of the Transport and Infrastructure Select Committee for a short amount of time, but one of the MPs from my own party was really keen on that particular committee, so I let him have it, and I became a floater for the other. So usually you're on two, and I became a floater for the other day. I wasn't on select committee, which is really interesting because you get to see you have a look across all the other work. But my most favorite, and the one that I held a position on for 6 years, was the Education and Workforce Committee. So again, starting off as a member, and then in the second term I became the chair of that committee. And I had huge satisfaction in bringing a lot of the skills that I learned during my high performance, high engagement time at Air New Zealand and the unions to that committee. So working collaboratively, establishing relationships, and just getting more work done because you had that more collaborative relationship with each other.
And least favourite thing about being an MP?
Oh, it probably has to be the public aspect of it. I think the public aspect prevents people sometimes from doing certain things they would otherwise pursue. So, for example, if you make certain promises because you want to achieve a lot and you don't quite get to all of it, it could be held against you because you've said it publicly. So it makes people cautious, perhaps not promising these things. Or, yeah, I think the public aspect on yourself, also on your family, that's a really awful thing. I've actually said it in my valedictory and it was one of the most frustrating parts of the job was seeing some of my colleagues being dragged through the mud, being hunted down for any weakness or perceived weakness. And I think that is the ugly aspect of that particular job. Yeah.
So, of course, during your first term in Parliament, major global event, a pandemic, hit New Zealand. Where were you when the news of what was going to happen in New Zealand started to break? Where were you and what were you doing? Do you have any memories of that?
Yeah, it was a very different time and a very difficult time. I remember the first time it kind of became serious was at the end of January, when we were at an out of Parliament Labour Party meeting. The media was there and they started to interview our leadership on this virus that came out of China. And of course, we had heard by then of the increasing amount of cases of this unknown illness. And it was about a month later that we had our first virus case in New Zealand. And so we're talking the end of February. It was a week later that measures started to be taken. And so everything went really, really fast. So that was the first week of March from memory. And by then it was pretty serious because we could see what was happening in the rest of the world and we knew it would be coming to us. And I believe that the understanding that our vulnerable communities would be hit hardest made the actions happen that our leadership took, because we could see that it would result in so many deaths that something had to happen. But it's quite weird to describe because it felt uncertain, but at the same time it felt reassured, because whenever we got the briefings, which was very regularly over Zoom on our caucus meetings, you felt that the messaging was very consistent and it was very reassuring that we knew what to do, even though there were so many unknowns in the process, if that kind of makes sense.
Were we prepared enough, or was anybody prepared enough when it all happened?
Yeah, no, I don't think so. I think it was an unprecedented event that was taking a direction that I don't think the whole world was ever expecting. A worldwide pandemic of unprecedented scale. And I guess the only thing you can do is doing the best that you can with the information you have at the time, which I saw our leadership do. I believe that the daily stand-ups of our Prime Minister with the Director General of Health gave certainty and transparency on what we were doing, what the plan was in the context of an unknown scenario. So, and I know that, with the benefit of hindsight, you can always say, maybe this should have happened or that should have happened or things should have been done differently, but that is hindsight. When you're in the middle of something that is completely unprecedented and nobody knows what is happening except that it's resulting in a lot of people dying, you need to take some drastic action, and that is what was being done.
I mean, you were in a very unique position that only 120 people were MPs during this time. As a backbench MP, how much decision making was able to be done, or was it more along the lines of the leadership just taking charge and running with the advice? Because my understanding is that much of it was driven by health advice. How much were you able to express your voice in these processes?
Yeah, I guess our role as backbench MPs and people representing their areas became more significant during the times of measures like the different level systems and how they affected our communities during the lockdowns and the significant consequences, for example, especially in Auckland, on our communities, on the whole ways of say groceries getting to supermarkets and businesses being able to be run, and all of those unprecedented events that took place. So we were feeding back to our leadership, but of course it is that leadership ultimately that takes the advice, as you said, based on health advice and makes the decisions. But we were always having input on behalf of our communities, and therefore, those really regular touch-ins with us were really important, and we always felt that we were having that input as well.
Yeah, with the benefit of hindsight, like we discussed before, how do you feel that the country did overall?
I think we did well, and that also shows from the numbers and the data that came out afterwards. So the reports have been done, and internationally New Zealand has been praised for its approach to what was an unprecedented pandemic. When I look at some of the relative freedoms we've had during those, especially first 2 years, compared to other places in the world, and of course having my family in the Netherlands, it was an easy comparison where I was at some time, say late 2020, I could be at an event with hundreds or even thousands of people, where in the Netherlands, I was anxious for my parents even leaving their home because of the amount of community spread there was. So the difference in that way of living, yes, we had a significant lockdown in 2021, But overall, in those 2 years, we had relative freedoms that other places didn't have. Or they had them, but they had lots and lots of people dying, which we luckily managed to prevent.
Moving on from the pandemic, you were obviously in Parliament with some significant people that will go down in history as being a very major people in New Zealand history. And one of those is obviously Jacinda Ardern. We have an impression of her based on a very large amount of media and everything else. But what is she really like in person?
Yeah, it's funny you ask me, because it's a question that I got asked a lot over the time that I was in her team. And I'll tell you what I always told people. I would say she is exactly the same as what you see of her on TV. So whether she is talking to us in a caucus, or whether she is in a big business meeting or at an event, or if you speak with her one-on-one, she is always that person. She is, from my experience, very open-minded. She's a good listener. She is not judgmental, and she takes the time. I never saw her angry, and if there was an issue that was serious enough to speak to us in a serious way, we would really take it to heart, because we didn't quite often see that side of her, where she was laying down the law. She was most of the time really just part of a team. And despite, yes, she was our leader, but she was also that team player, if that makes any sense. So yeah, I always say to people, she was exactly what you would see on TV.
Are there any specific interactions that you're able to share that just kind of demonstrate your relationship with that leadership and Jacinda?
Yeah, one of the things that I remember quite significantly is actually from during the COVID time. When we were having, the only connection was through our Zoom meetings and also watching the daily stand-up. And at one of those stand-ups, at some stage, the Prime Minister and the Director General of Health shared with us that they found COVID in the wastewater in Warkworth. So Warkworth was mentioned, which is one of the areas I represented. And that had never happened before. So obviously I knew I would get lots of questions from the communities, because I was always in touch through my social media and through telephone and everything else, except not being live. But I wanted to know what was happening. So I got my phone and I texted our Labour mobile thread. You know, we have a group signal. And so I texted saying, I just heard the Prime Minister mention Warkworth. Are there any more details? Within a couple of minutes, there was an answer. And it was from Jacinda herself. And I saw her standing at the podium, but she had answered my question. So she's standing there doing the stand-up. She's having, giving information and getting questions from the media. Yet she managed to also answer my question. And funnily enough, one other colleague then responded and said, well, that is the definition of multitasking. And that's exactly what she did. There was quite often somebody would put a question on the thread, and it was the Prime Minister who answered. It's like she was across everything. And she was also aware enough and kind enough to understand the anxiety that particular mention would have brought from me and my community. So she wanted to relay as much as she could as soon as possible. So I guess that was one example. The other one I can share is that I had my parents visiting a few months after I became an MP, my first year. And of course, they had to come to Parliament. And I mentioned that at caucus. And I said, afterwards, I said, Prime Minister, my parents are going to be there when we all walk to question time. And, maybe if you could give them a little wave, if I stand there with them, it would mean a lot to them. And she goes, oh, yes, of course, just wave and I'll see you, I'll spot you. And so the pressure when people go into the House, and especially on our ministers and the Prime Minister, is huge, because the bells ring from about 7 or 8 minutes before it's 2 o'clock, and they ring continuously, and you hear them quite loud. They ring and they ring and they ring. Everybody is rushing over the tiles. There's all this media there with their cameras and their microphones, and people are sort of trying to duck and dive to get through the crowd. And there's the Prime Minister, she's answering questions, and the media's, walking behind her with the microphones and the cameras, and I'm standing there with my parents waving. And she doesn't just wave, she actually stops. She comes up to my parents, she shakes their hand, says hi to my dad, says hi to my mum, and she asks them how they find New Zealand, and she tells them how proud she is of having me in her team. And it's like, you should have seen the look on my parents' face. So that little moment in time, under all that pressure that she took, that can make such a difference for people. And I think that's the thing she was aware of, and that's why kindness does describe her, is that she would always know how much things like that could mean to people and make a difference.
Outside of Jacinda then, are there any other people in your time in Parliament that you felt particularly strong bond to, or have immense amount of extra respect for? Not, I mean, obviously you have respect for a lot of them, but are there any 2 or 3 other names and any other stories that you think would be valuable to know?
Look, it's hugely different, because as soon as you ask me that question, there's probably a dozen names go through my head. And I think it'd be really unfair if I started to pick off one or the other, because I'll forget. And some of them actually have become really good friends. But I guess the thing with a team like that is that because you're driven by the same morals and values, it is natural that you become so close, that you become friendly because you make those connections. I will mention, though, Grant Robertson, because as finance minister, the decisions that he took, and he recently announced that he will resign from Parliament. But the amount of pressure that he had on making decisions that he did in the time that we went through, and the way that we came out of it, I can only have such huge respect for him, of how he led us as part of that senior leader team. But also he's a really good person who would always find time for you, no matter how busy he was, and extremely funny as well. So yeah, I'm not going to go name any more names, because I could keep talking for a long time.
Fair enough too. What about on the other team? Do you have any people that you stay in contact with that you have become friends with on the other team at all?
Yeah, probably not as friendly as with my own team, but of course, you deal with people, you're going to have good relationships with them. In that regard, some of the parliamentary delegations do bring those relationships to bear. One of the most unlikely people I thought I would ever get close to is someone like David Carter. But we went on a parliamentary, interparliamentary union event to Doha, and I got on really well with him, because if you see people out of the politics, you get on as people. And Tolly as well. I learned a lot from her in her role. We were co-chairing the parliamentary friendship group together. And she was always very patient in teaching me the ropes. Even my National Party electorate MP, Chris Penk, we had a very civil relationship, and did a lot of events and organizing in the electorate together. Because, let's be honest, nobody really wants to see their MPs infighting, and it doesn't serve the people on the ground. So I, very early on, made myself a commitment to work together and, again, bring that collaborative aspect to it. And I think we did really well over those years.
So obviously as an MP, you did bring something quite unique to Parliament with your Dutch connection and your Dutch history. So you early on made a decision to also be an advocate for the Dutch community. And how was that received by people in your caucus and the community generally?
Yeah, really well, actually. I spoke a tiny bit of Dutch. Doe maar gewoon, dan doe je al gek genoeg, I said, which means just act normal, that's already crazy enough. And that was picked up by Dutch people. It's actually amazing how many people do watch Parliament TV. So I got approached by certain places in the Dutch community. I also got connected with the Dutch ambassadors. And by the way, the Dutch community is very well served. That all of the Dutch ambassadors they've had have been amazing people. And they have basically made a lot of effort to integrate me into those communities, make the connections, ask me to come to events. And I have been able to do a lot of things because of those connections, and really enjoyed it, and also bring that representation to Parliament that wasn't there, because I'm obviously the first Dutch-born MP in the New Zealand Parliament, part of the ethnic caucus, and my colleagues embraced it. As an example, Kelvin Davis, our deputy leader, he asked me to say a prayer at Waitangi dawn service in Dutch, in my mother tongue. And that is one of those moments that you're standing there at, 5 in the morning, talking Dutch inside a place that is so Maori tikanga. It feels quite unreal at times. And that has been my experience, being able to represent a community like that on that level in New Zealand. It's been a real privilege.
Other than obviously your participation in the Dutch Week speech competition, were there any other really memorable or impactful events that you were part of within the Dutch community as an MP?
Yeah, I guess being at the war memorial events, so commemorating the 4th of May. I was there, was asked to speak as well, and my son actually held the Dutch flag at that event. And I guess that was significant in a way that I could see the next generation and their connection still to the place that I came from, which I have seen all through. And you mentioned the Dutch speech competition. And again, you could see that connection to their roots from the next generation of Dutch immigrants coming up. And that's really lovely to see. Dutch Week in Foxton, opening of Te Awa Nieuwe Stroom in Oranjehof. And again, seeing the tikanga and the influence of the Dutch migrants sitting so comfortably together. That was quite impressive. And all the work of Boudewijn Club when it comes to Anne Frank. There have been so many times that I've just really been touched by that connection to where I come from.
Every so often there's a New Zealand versus the Netherlands sporting contest. How do you dress? Do you put on a little bit of orange and a little bit of black, or how do you feel when those kind of events happen?
That is a very dangerous territory. I could say I sort of tend to think about, well, who's winning, and I go for that team, but that is very unfair. I love, so when we had the Women's Cup, I loved being in Dunedin, dressing up in orange and cheering on the Dutch. But at the same time, I would also cheer on any of the New Zealand teams. I guess, and this is something that I actually saw on a plaque in Te Awa Nieuwe Stroom, that as a Dutch immigrant, I've always felt very comfortable having a foot in each camp. So I feel Dutch, I feel Kiwi, and that doesn't, it's not a clash, it's actually a really comfortable combination.
I personally feel exactly the same way.
Yeah.
I know exactly what you mean. So you briefly mentioned the ambassadors. As a backbench MP, you would be one of the more unique ones who has those kind of high-level conversations with international kind of diplomatic people like ambassadors. How did the rest of your colleagues respond to you having these kind of almost, let's call them international relations kind of conversations? Was there any kind of like what's going on there kind of things, or anything at all?
No, never. People really commended me on seeking out that connection with the Dutch as well as with the Indonesian communities, and establishing the relationships. I guess anything we can do as MPs to make a connection to a place that most people don't really know, that sits up there somewhere, that feels like it might not affect you. Any way that you can make people feel that they are part of it, that we are representative of them as well, is important work, because that is what democracy is about. So my colleagues have only ever really been supportive of me seeking out those connections.
And what would be your assessment of the relationship right now between Aotearoa, New Zealand, and the Netherlands? Where do you think we stand together as two nations?
Yeah, well, obviously we go back a long time to 1642 when Abel Tasman first laid eyes on Aotearoa, New Zealand. And now we are having over 150,000 people that feel they have Dutch ancestry. So there's a big connection between our two countries. We look at academic and research connections with Messi University and Wageningen. We look at the only waka that is in Europe, in Leiden, Te Honoki Aotearoa, which literally means the link to New Zealand. And of course, the students coming up to Waitangi and practicing those waka protocols. And then at international events, because of the alphabetic structure, New Zealand and the Netherlands end up sitting next to each other. And I was in Doha and I met members of the Eerste and Tweede Kamer because we were sitting right there. So we have the same values, very similar goals, and we can learn a lot from each other. So our countries are very, very close.
Where do you see the future of that going? I mean, obviously there's a lot of uncertainty and conflict in the world right now, and New Zealand has in recent years, they've become quite a lot closer to our European, can we call them partners, allies, Netherlands being a very major player in those events. Where do you see the future of the New Zealand-Netherlands relationship?
Yeah, I guess despite us being on opposite sides of the world, like I said before, we have a lot of commonalities. There's a lot that ties us, not just the shared history and the amount of people here with that ancestry, but we also have a lot that we can learn from each other. As an example, in 2019, when the Premier Rutte visited New Zealand, he signed, together with our Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern, he signed the joint statement, cooperation statement on climate change, for the countries to work together in that regard. And like I said, there's so much that we can learn from each other, and I just hope that it gets stronger and stronger. We have ministers visiting the Netherlands quite a lot of times over the last few years. Again, with those connections between our universities, there's a lot of information exchange. I just see that continuing from strength to strength.
And what about the Dutch community in New Zealand? We have seen it probably change over the last maybe decade or two, being more focused on Dutch New Zealanders rather than Dutch people who immigrated to New Zealand. Where do you see the Dutch community going over the next few years?
We established the Office for Ethnic Communities, and I was part of the Ethnic Caucus, and so the Dutch as a community are part of that as well. So it's not a case anymore like I heard from people that immigrated here half a century ago, of people that came from the Netherlands and then assimilated, pepper potter, I think they called it in the bad history. But now we recognize that we are diverse as a country, we embrace that diversity, and we actually learn and applaud. The Dutch have an extremely good name for themselves. When I first came to New Zealand in '89, I could pick up almost every job by just saying I was Dutch, because the reputation of being hard workers and being straight up people had really embedded itself over those decades. So we are, in my view, a very well-respected part of the communities in New Zealand.
2023 came along, and obviously you decided to finish up. What were the main reasons that you decided to finish up in Parliament?
Yeah, I spoke about that a little bit before. I think it was mostly the strain it has on your family, and you. For me, the way you do this job is you really give it all. So that means huge amount of work, huge amount of hours. And before you leave Parliament in those 3 days, you would have already done a full working week. 45 hours would have been done in those 3 days. And then you have all the rest of the time still to go through. And on top of that, you had all the travel. This is a massive electorate, and the travel that was involved is just huge. So my main reason really was to not have the energy. I could not see myself have the energy to potentially do it for another term. And I think it's better that people are there that have the fresh blood and the keen eyes and can give it all, rather than just being there trying to sort of make do with what you got.
Do you think that that's why a lot of other countries have like term limits and things like that? Because just that energy level that you need to do a job like this?
I had to say, because I guess it is different for everyone. It's just, I can only talk for myself.
No job description, right?
Yeah, no job description again. But if you look at what a day would look like, and this is something that people probably don't realize, is that you start between 7 and 8, and then Parliament sits until 10 o'clock at night. So after 10 o'clock at night, you may still have to do your reading for the next morning as well, when you're going to your select committees and your meetings. So your hours are massive. 15, 16-hour days are quite normal. And for me, there was only so long I could do that before burning out. So
over that whole period of time, what do you think you would classify as something that you are the most proud of your time in Parliament?
Yeah, it's a difficult one, because I was a backbench MP in government. That means you don't get spokes roles, for example. But my work in the select committee as chair, I feel was really important, because I would bring that collaborative aspect to how we all work together. And I think giving people an opportunity to submit freely and feel that they have an opportunity to contribute is really important. And I think as chair, you often set the tone in that discussion. The other thing, I guess, is the role I could play, and it was a real privileged role, in getting conversion practices banned in New Zealand. So conversion practices where people are trying to suppress or change a person's gender identity or sexual orientation is something that was happening. And New Zealand, as one of the few countries in the world, banned it in early 2022. And I was part of the advocacy for that since I first became an MP. I had a members' bill in the ballot, which then became a government bill, and giving the rainbow communities that reassurance that we were listening, that we were doing everything we could to keep them safe. Being a small part in that kaupapa was really important. Yes.
So you've had about 5 months since leaving Parliament, a bit of time to reflect and recharge. What does the future look like?
Wow. Funnily enough, if I look at the way my working life has gone to date, I tend up just ending up doing things. It's never a real set career choice. Even getting into Parliament, as I said before, was kind of like, oh yeah, I'll do some campaigning, I'll get a party vote out. Oh, oops, no, I'm an MP. What does it mean? So I do have worked on my CV, and I am going to actively think about what's next. But at this moment in time, I couldn't tell you yet.
I'm really grateful for your time, and this is the first time that obviously that I've done something like this, and the fact that you took my crazy idea and ran with it is something that hopefully the entire audience will appreciate as well. So thank you very much for your time.
My pleasure.
Thank you.